Axel Rudikabana pled guilty to killing the three young girls at the Taylor Swift-themed dance class in Southport last summer. The Home Secretary has revealed he was known to multiple authorities in the years before the horrific attack. So there are two issues this morning that the Prime Minister may address. One is, why wasn't he stopped before those murders were carried out? And the second issue is how much was known and how much should have been declared after the attacks, which may have stopped the riots breaking out.
Separate questions, but obviously inextricably linked. We'll go straight to Downing Street when the PM comes out. But in the meantime, we're joined by the former Chief Superintendent with the Metropolitan Police, Dal Babu, who has spoken out against counter-extremism scheme Prevent, alongside GB News presenter and Mail consultant editor Andrew Pearce and the former Labour MP Jonathan Ashworth. But let's begin with you. Where did this go so horribly wrong? Because when we look back at it now, all right, with a degree of hindsight, it's like looking at a slow-motion car crash. There's an almost unbelievable inevitability about this tragedy. What went wrong?
Well, unfortunately, Prevent has struggled to deliver what it's supposed to do, which is to deal with extremism for over a decade.
Why?
I think we don't know a great deal about Prevent. We don't know the numbers. We don't know, because once people are identified Prevent, they could go into what's called the Channel Project.
Going to stop you there, Dal Babu. I apologise. Here's the Prime Minister, Downing Street.
Come back to you in a minute.
The senseless, barbaric murder of three young girls in Southport is a devastating moment in our history. No words come anywhere close to expressing the brutality and horror in this case. Every parent in Britain will have had the same thought. It could have been anywhere. It could have been our children. But it was Southport. It was Bibi, 6 years old. Elsie, 7. Alice, 9. Back in August, I said there would be a time for questions, but that first justice had to be done, and that above all, we must not interfere with the work of the police, the prosecutors, and the delivery of that justice. Well, yesterday, thankfully, a measure of justice was done, but it won't bring those girls back to their families, and it won't remove the trauma from the lives of those who were injured. Their lives will never be the same. So before I turn to the questions that must now be answered, for the families and the nation, I first want to recognise their unimaginable grief, because I know the whole country grieves for them. The tragedy of the Southport killings must be a line in the sand for Britain. We must make sure the names of those three young girls are not associated with the vile perpetrator, but instead with a fundamental change in how Britain protects its citizens and its children. In pursuit of that, we must, of course, ask and answer difficult questions, questions that should be far-reaching, unburdened by cultural or institutional sensitivities, and driven only by the pursuit of justice. That is what we owe the families. The responsibility for this barbaric act lies, as it always does, with the vile individual who carried it out. But that is no comfort. And more importantly, it is no excuse. And so, as part of the inquiry launched by the Home Secretary yesterday, I will not let any institution of the state deflect from their failure. Failure which, in this case, frankly, leaps off the page. For example, the perpetrator was referred to the Prevent programme on 3 separate occasions. In 2019, once, and in 2021, twice. Yet on each of these occasions, a judgment was made that he did not meet the threshold for intervention, a judgment that was clearly wrong and which failed those families. And I acknowledge that here today. Throughout this case, to this point, we have only been focused on justice. If this trial had collapsed because I or anyone else had revealed crucial details while the police were investigating, while the case was being built, while we were awaiting a verdict, then the vile individual who committed these crimes would have walked away a free man. The prospect of justice destroyed for the victims and their families. I would never do that. And nobody would ever forgive me if I had. That is why the law of this country forbade me or anyone else from disclosing details sooner. Nonetheless, it is now time for those questions. And the first of those is whether this was a terrorist attack. The blunt truth here is that this case is a sign. Britain now faces a new threat. Terrorism has changed. In the past, the predominant threat was highly organised groups with clear political intent, groups like Al-Qaeda. That threat, of course, remains. But now, alongside that, we also see acts of extreme violence perpetrated by loners, misfits, young men in their bedroom, accessing all manner of material online, desperate for notoriety. Sometimes inspired by traditional terrorist groups, but fixated on that extreme violence, seemingly for its own sake. Now, it may well be that people like this are harder to spot, but we can't shrug our shoulders and accept that. We can't have a national security system that fails to tackle people who are a danger to our values, our security, our children. We have to be ready to face every threat. And when I look through the details of this case, the extreme nature of the violence, the meticulous plan to attack young children in a place of joy and safety, violence clearly intended to terrorise, then I understand why people wonder what the word terrorism means. And so if the law needs to change to recognise this new and dangerous threat, then we will change it, and quickly. And we will also review our entire counter-extremist system to make sure we have what we need to defeat it. Now, that work is already underway. I've tasked Sir David Anderson Casey, the new Independent Prevent Commissioner, to hold this system to account, to shine a light into its darkest corners, so the British people can have confidence that action will follow words. But I have to say, to face up to this new threat, there are also bigger questions. Questions such as how we protect our children from the tidal wave of violence freely available online. Because you can't tell me that the material this individual viewed before committing these murders should be accessible on mainstream social media platforms, that with just a few clicks, people can watch video after horrific video. Videos that in some cases are never taken down. No, that cannot be right. But it's not just the nightmares of the online world, because when you wake from a nightmare, the first thing you do is reassure yourself with reality. But for far too many people, the state of our society no longer does that. Now, people will say this is all because of immigration or all because of funding cuts. But in truth, neither tells us anything like the full story or explains this case properly. No, this goes deeper. A growing sense that the rights and responsibilities that we owe to one another, the set of unwritten rules that hold a nation together, have in recent years been ripped apart. Children who've stopped going to school since the pandemic. Young people who've opted out of work or education. More and more people retreating into parallel lives, whether through failures of integration or just a country slowly turning away from itself. Wounds that politics, for all that it may have contributed, must try to heal. Thirdly, there are also questions about the accountability of the Whitehall and Westminster system, a system that is far too often driven by circling the institutional wagons, that does not react until justice is either hard won by campaigners or until appalling tragedies like this finally spur a degree of action. Time and again, we see this pattern. And people are right to be angry about it. I'm angry about it. Southport must be a line in the sand. But nothing will be off the table in this inquiry. Nothing. And most importantly, it will lead to change. I know people will be watching right now and they'll be saying, we've heard all this before, the promises, the sorrow, the inquiry that comes and goes, an inability to change that, frankly, has become the oxygen of wider conspiracy. And we've seen that throughout this case. A suggestion that there has been a cover-up. I want to put on record that yesterday's guilty verdict only happened because hundreds, if not thousands, of dedicated public servants worked towards it, many of whom endured absolutely harrowing circumstances, particularly in the police and the Crown Prosecution Service. That is their job. They are brilliant at it. But we should never forget their service to our country. Law and order depend on them. And yet I'm under no illusions that until the wider state shows the country it can change, not just what it delivers for people, but also its culture, then this atmosphere of mistrust will remain. So I want to be crystal clear in front of the British people today. We will leave no stone unturned. I was the prosecutor who first spotted failures in grooming cases in my institution, the CPS, 14 years ago. And I was the prosecutor who first did something about it by bringing the rape gangs in Rochdale to justice. And so my approach as Prime Minister will be no different. If any shortcomings are now holding back the ability of this country to keep its citizens and its children safe, I will find them and I will root them out. Because when it comes to justice, the failure to be transparent is not only disgraceful on its own terms, it is also the enemy of strong communities. It spreads suspicion more widely and allows division to win. I remember when this happened, in those dark days of the summer. And I remember that, like now, the whole country grieved for Southport. But I also remember how it was profoundly moved by their example. Because even as that community faced an unimaginable evil, even as they had to endure mindless violence, bricks and bottles thrown at their community, their businesses, their mosque, police officers attacked, including those who are on the scene responding to this vile murder. Even despite all of that, they chose to come together. They chose to pick up the pieces of their lives. They chose to rebuild, brick by brick, side by side. Strangers no longer strangers, a community. This country has no shortage of empathy for the people of Southport. I know that. But in the face of such darkness and tragedy, what we really should do is follow their example. That is what we need to face this new threat. But also something more. Because national renewal isn't just about public services or the economy. It's about turning us back towards ourselves, giving people confidence in a shared future, so people can once again see the strength and power in themselves and in this nation. But that can only begin today, by holding up the mirror and facing what we see. So wherever this inquiry goes, we will follow it. No matter the boats it will rock, no matter the vested interests it will threaten, we won't hide. But then, most importantly of all, we will act. Because this time it will be different. Southport will be a line in the sand. We will honour those 3 little girls and deliver not just justice, but the change that the people and families of Southport deserve. Thank you. I will now take a number of questions.
So a change in the definition of terrorism, restrictions on the availability of extreme material online, 2 very positive proposals there, but a robust defence about the lack of candour after the fact, saying that that would have possibly prejudiced the trial.
So let's discuss this with former Chief Superintendent of the Met, Dal Babu, and, of course, Andrew Pearson, Jonathan Ashworth as well. Firstly, Dal Babu, as a former very senior police officer, this change in the threshold for investigating someone for being a terrorist, effectively. I mean, everybody looked at this attack and thought, this is a terror attack. But the guy was rejected by the Prevent scheme because he didn't reach the threshold for a terrorist.
Well, so it's pretty shocking. I think we need to be very, very clear. This was failure on a grand scale, a failure that led to the murder of 3 innocent girls. So we need to be brutally honest about that. And I think we need to be very understanding of the Prime Minister's commitment. He's very, very clear. He was clearly very angry. He didn't mince his words. You know, he wants some action. He wants things to be done differently. But clearly, if you look at what happened, 3 referrals to Prevent, as you said, Susanna, not met the threshold. How could that be? We had this individual going to a school with a hockey stick, breaking somebody's wrist. We had this same individual who then attempted to get into a taxi armed with knives to go back to the school and was stopped. So,
a week before these murders.
A week before. So this is common sense. Yeah. This is absolute common sense.
What did you make of his admission? I think his phrase was, the failure leaps off the page to prevent these murders from taking place, but his strong dividing line between acknowledging that and defending the lack of candour after the murders had been committed about what was known about this man, because he said that could have prejudiced a fair trial and a conviction.
Well, I mean, I come from a criminal justice background. Keir Starmer comes from a criminal justice background. If you listen to the Chief Constable of Merseyside, they are all saying the same thing. They do not want to risk a trial being derailed and ended. So you err on the side of caution. Now, the CPS are the people who make the decision.
Crown Prosecution Service.
Sorry, the Crown Prosecution Service. They make the decision, and they have said, look, this is not information that you can release. However, I think it's very, very important to understand that even though he was under 18, they did actually release his details. So I think that was unprecedented in many cases because you don't have that information released.
Andrew and Jonathan, a couple of other important facts. Sir Keir Starmer said Axel Rudiger was looking at stuff online that should not be online. Once it's flagged, it should be taken down.
Yeah.
How on earth they've still got access to that? At the same time, let's remember, you know, we heard President Trump in America with Elon Musk from Twitter in his cabinet saying it's the return of free speech. And we heard Mark Zuckerberg at Meta, Facebook, saying we're not going to do so much censorship. So it looks like we might be going in a different direction.
And good.
Yes.
Because the dark net is a terrible place, and so many young men and women are getting radicalised there. And if finally we're going to have a Prime Minister who says we're going to curb access to it, that's good news. We've heard it before, I have to say, and he said, I know people will say we've heard it before, endless Prime Minister say we've got to stop young people, but they've got to find a way to block it.
And what did you make of his promise, really, to redefine what terrorism actually is?
Well, that man should not have been on the streets.
No.
He was sick and he should have been locked up.
Well,
so they have to find a way to lock people like that have to be locked up.
He didn't meet the mental health threshold in that sense. He didn't meet the terrorism threshold.
Even though we saw what he'd been looking at.
Jonathan Ashworth, what we need is a threshold where the guy's clearly a violent threat and somehow needs to be addressed.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I thought overall that was a very strong statement from Keir. I thought there was a number of things in that we're talking about the failure of this Prevent programme, which we've been talking about earlier on the programme. I've seen that for myself in Leicester. He's also said that we're not going to have Whitehall and Westminster circling the wagons. We're going to get to the bottom of this. We're sick of whenever things go wrong in the system, it being sort of, you know, people's concerns are being dismissed. I think this is going to lead to some very radical action. I also thought he was very strong on defending the position that he took. He's basically just said to Nigel Farage and the sort of numbskull Tory politicians who flirted with this cover-up conspiracy online, he's basically said that potentially could have meant that murderer yesterday could have gone free because he could have jeopardised that trial. That's a very strong rebuttal to those who've been playing around with this online.
Significantly, that was not the view of the KC you interviewed at the beginning of the programme, who's the government's independent advisor on terrorism. He said that more information should have been released because it would not have...
No, but Starmer really doubled down on that, didn't he? He didn't give an inch on it.
Well, that's going to be a key area of this inquiry.
Yes, he seemed to be...
And people would take a view.
He seemed to be focusing almost all his critical attention on what happened before the murders, before the stabbings. That seemed to be the emphasis.
Well, I think that's the key. I think it's very, very important. Actually, it's quite interesting listening to Jonathan and Andrew, two people who have very, very different views, and people are being very sensible. And I think that's what we need to be doing. This is about how we prevent this horrific event ever happening again. We owe it to those three girls.
Can I ask you something? As a copper yourself, had you been in charge in Liverpool when this was unfolding, this information was coming to light about this man before he committed the murders, what would you have done?
I think I'd be looking at arrests. And I mean, what's quite worrying is how different agencies, because it was not just Prevent, it was a whole range of different agencies. So Children's Services have got some questions, the Health Service have got some questions. So there's a whole range of organisations.
What would you have charged him with?
Well, I mean, he'd assaulted somebody. He was we know there was multiple calls to the address. He'd attacked his family. There was a whole range of things that you could have considered.
Detained him.
Yeah, and I think we need to be looking at that. But I think that the difficulty we have is, I mean, and I'm not a politician. The danger is politicians of getting involved, and this is not a political issue. This is about making sensible decisions. We would have an entirely different debate here if this trial had collapsed because people had made comments and the case was thrown out.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us, Dal Babu, formerly of the Metropolitan Police, Jonathan Ashworth and Andrew Pearce.